Today, I want to briefly talk about calling and preparation because I think oftentimes when we speak of calling, we think about something that we should be doing, something that we are called to do. And usually that is the case because calling comes from God. Calling is something that God has commissioned you to do for the purposes of helping others. So when we're called to do something, we're not just called to do something just because God has called us to do something, but God calls us to assignments, to people for a reason. Because the reason He's calling us is because there are people who God has assigned to us, and there is a gift that He has placed inside of us to be able to share that gift with those He has assigned us to. So, and I think a lot of times we get calling and passion kind of confused. We think it's the same thing, but it is totally different because we can be passionate about something. We can be passionate about the work that we do. We can be passionate about the people that we help and serve. But is this a calling? Has God called you to do this? Because with passion, we can burn out. We can get tired of it. We can get tired in it. And when we get burnt out and tired in it, then we're not really interested in it anymore. But with calling as well, we still can get tired in our calling. We can get burnt out in our calling. But I believe the difference with passion and calling, we can't just abandon it like we do with a passion, with those passion projects that we have. When we get tired of it, when we feel like it's not serving us anymore, because again, calling is not about us. It's about the people that God has assigned to us and assigned us to. So with calling, it is much, much deeper, and we must be prepared for the call. So when God calls us, and there are so many examples in the Bible of how God called people and how He prepared them for the calling. So God doesn't just call us and then He just pushes us out there. We have to be prepared. We might receive the call in one season, and then God prepare us to fulfill that call, and we won't be prepared to actually carry out the call, the assignment that God has assigned to us until another season, or another season after that, or another season after that. So you may get the calling in one season, then and you think that, oh, the next day you're supposed to start walking in the giftings and the calling that God has given you. And I believe the gifts that God has given us, He's given us these gifts from birth. But these gifts have to be nurtured. These gifts have to be matured. We have to be prepared to begin to walk in these gifts. And I think a lot of times we start walking try to start walking in our giftings prematurely when we have not been prepared to walk in the callings and the gifts that God has gave us. So when we talk about calling, when we get the call from God, and I don't believe every time God calls us, we will hear say this audible voice from God. And I believe some people are called that way. And we see examples in the Bible where God spoke to people. God spoke to Moses through the burning bush, how God calls people. And then we see with Joseph's story, how he was betrayed by his brothers and he had to serve time in prison before the call that God had given him. But God has spoke to these people, and the call on their life, just because it wasn't fulfilled right away, just because they didn't start walking in the giftings and the calling right away, it doesn't mean that God didn't call them. And I think with calling and passion, a lot of times we are walking in what we're passionate about and not really called to, and that's why we give up so easily. We abandon the assignment so easily. But with calling, God calls us to specific things because you were created for a reason. You were created for a purpose, on purpose, right? So your creation, God creating you, your entrance into the world, you being here, your birth, your creation by God, your conception, it wasn't in vain. It wasn't by accident. You're here for a reason, because there is a specific assignment that God has for you. And what God calls us to, whatever it is He calls us to, He prepares us for it. He doesn't just call us and then just send us out there to do the work that He has called us to do. So let's talk about that preparation, because with the calling comes the preparation. And so we don't want to just go out there and try to start walking in the giftings and the assignment that God has called us to, because the gift, it would get us there. The Bible says your gift will, make room for you and bring you before great men. But we also have to be prepared. We can't just get out there and start operating in our gifts. But we have to operate in it to perfect it, right? Don't get me wrong. But I think when we discover what our gifts are, we just want to get out there so quick and so prematurely when God has not developed us and prepared us the way that He wants to. So with calling and preparation, you must be prepared. And a lot of times that preparation, you're going to be in a wilderness season. That wilderness season is a season where it can be uncomfortable. And you may think that God didn't really call you to this assignment because of the discomfort that you are experiencing. But just know that just because you're experiencing discomfort, just because you're experiencing a little trouble, some obstacles, some barriers to what it is that you believe God has called you to do, that does not mean to abandon your assignment. That does not mean that God didn't really call you. It's just some things that God has to take you through to prepare you for where it is that He's taking you. And if you don't go through that, then you won't know how to successfully walk in the giftings and the assignment that God has called you to. So when we think about calling, and there are so many misconceptions, I believe, out there around calling, because we think when we get the call from God, then boom, we're supposed to just start walking in it. When God say, I called you to preach, I called you to teach, I called you to be a doctor, a musician, whatever it is, God called you to this assignment, but that does not mean that He does not prepare you for it. He has to prepare you for it, but He want to call you to know that this is what I'm calling you to. And a lot of times we don't even realize what our calling is, or even discover what our calling is until we lived a little bit. We have to live a little before we even begin to walk in our callings. A lot of times people don't even get the call until they're much older in life. Now, God does call some people when they are younger, I do believe, but a lot of times we don't get that calling until we are much older in life. And we've lived a little. We've had some life experiences to where we know how to operate in the giftings and the calling that God has called us to. Because the call, again, it is different from passion. So when God calls us, He's going to prepare us. He's going to oftentimes take us through what it's called the wilderness season. And that season is going to be uncomfortable, but He has to develop you. He has to develop you in the dark and not in the light. You don't want to get out there in the spotlight and be out there before people and you're not fully prepared. So God wants to develop you in the darkness, in the wilderness season. He has to take you through some things to prepare you for where He's taking you, because He wants you to be your best when you're out there, because you're representing Him. You are representing Him. Everything we're doing, the call when it comes is because God is using us to be His hands and feet in the earth. He's using us to be an example, to lead by example, and He wants to make sure that we're prepared to do that. We never want to get out there prematurely and we haven't heard from God, we haven't prayed, we haven't been in fellowship with God, we haven't spent any time with God. We never want to get out there and not be doing what God has prepared us to do, because God is going to prepare you. If He's going to call you, He's going to qualify you, because He doesn't call the qualified. He qualified those that He calls, okay? So don't ever feel like, oh, okay, I'm not qualified, I'm not prepared, because God is going to prepare you. You just have to accept the call. Many are called, but few are chosen. So when God chose you, He chose you for a reason, and you have to allow Him to do the work in you. So I just want to encourage you to don't be discouraged. Don't feel like, okay, did God really call me to this? Because most likely He did. If God spoke to you about it, then I'm pretty sure He called you to this work. And a lot of times the call that you have on your life, the gifting that you have on your life, what God has called you to, the assignment that God has called you to, is something that you've experienced, something that you already experienced. And so it's not going to be something foreign to you. It's something that you're going to know how to walk in this assignment. You're going to know how to do what it is that God is calling you to do. He's going to help you first and foremost. He's going to help you. He's going to prepare you. You know, like God told Jeremiah was afraid because he was so young. He was just a youth. He was like, God, how are you going to use me? God said, look, I'm going to tell you what to do. I'm going to put my words in your mouth. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. He's going to show you, but you just have to believe. You have to have faith. You have to trust God and trust that he's going to help you every step of the way. We can't allow fear to hinder us and hold us back from what it is that God has called us to do. So when we think about calling, just know that it is a commission from God. And so he's sending us out in the world to do his work. He's sending us out, but he also has to prepare us before he sends us out. So just know, if you may be going through a season, if you received the call from God and you're going through a season right now where it's uncomfortable, you're confused, you don't know, you don't even really know if this was a call from God, because you're just so confused about the whole situation and you don't know where to turn. Continue to stay in prayer. Continue to talk to God about it. And the more you talk to God, the more you're in prayer, God is going to show you. God is going to give you revelation. Revelation is insight to something that you have not known before. But when God calls you, he's also going to prepare you. He doesn't call us and just send us out there, and not know what it is that we're doing. But a lot of times we're just not patient. We're not exemplifying that fruit of the Spirit, which is long suffering and patience, to where we sit with God and get instruction from God about what it is that we need to do. We have to sit with God. We have to hear from God and wait on God. And when we're waiting on God, it doesn't mean we're just sitting there twirling our fingers waiting for God. We have to be moving while we are waiting. But wait on the instruction. Don't do what God don't tell you to do. A lot of times we're waiting when we haven't even followed the last instruction that God gave us in the last season. So whatever that last thing that God told you to do, do that. Do that, and then continue to walk in what it is that God is calling you to do.